Good afternoon. My name is Shelly Rambo. I teach at Boston University School of Theology, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab's webinar on trauma. I'm really thrilled to have a panel of I don't know if they'd want to be called experts, but a panel of caregivers and just really excellent folks working in the area of trauma and care. I'm going to turn it over to Michael for just a minute to explain some technical things, and then we'll be back and the panel will begin.
Great, thank you, Shelly. I just want to give a quick reminder of a few things. This webinar is being recorded, and so if you need to leave early or if you miss a point or whatever, don't worry. You will get an email in a couple of days that has this recording in it, and so you can always go back and watch it after the fact. If you have any sort of technical questions, you can ask me in the chat box, and I'll do what I can to address them. I don't know that I'll be able to fix everything, but I will do what I can to address that. And then as you have questions for the panel, please put them in the question function over there on your control panel on the right, and we will do that after everyone has had a chance to speak for a few minutes. Shelly, I'll give it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'll do that right at the beginning, and I just want to say to them and to those of you who are attending, all of these folks are doing this. They said yes rather immediately, and I'm really thrilled because I think we have represented folks from a variety of different contexts. And so I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. We have Reverend Dr. Danielle Buhuro. Dr. Buhuro is a CPE certified educator currently serving at Advocate, South, Suburban, and Trinity hospitals in Chicago. She is the author of Is There a Heaven for G, a pastoral care approach to gang violence, and editor of a volume that came out very recently and is very timely, Spiritual Care in the Age of Black Lives Matter. Danielle is an ordained clergy with ministerial standing in the United Church of Christ. She is currently senior pastor of Lincoln Memorial Congregation, the first predominantly African-American UCC church in Illinois. So welcome, Danielle. Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg presently serves as a national organizer at Bend the Arc, which is a progressive Jewish organization advocating for racial justice. Rabbi Rosenberg is a 2018 graduate of Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and under her leadership, she conducted trainings, workshops, and developed resources for rabbis, rabbinical students, and other Jewish professionals serving individuals and communities impacted by trauma. We're thrilled to have her as the author of a really important work, Introduction to Trauma, Healing, and Resilience, which we'll share information about on our website, a helpful resource. We also welcome Reverend Mark Scott, who's a program director for Boston Neighborhood Trauma, the Boston Neighborhood Trauma Team, which is part of Trauma Response and Recovery Services through the Boston Public Health Commission. Reverend Scott is also associate pastor of Azusa Christian Community in Dorchester. I hope I can share this. Reverend Scott, I think, is in the process of becoming a spiritual director through Still Harbor. Is that right? So is either in that program or completing that program. So welcome, Reverend Scott. We also have Dr. Yetunde. Dr. Yetunde is Assistant Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling at United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities. Dr. Yetunde is a co-founder of the Center of the Heart and author of Buddhist Christian Dialogue, U.S. Law, and Womanist Theology for Transgender Spiritual Care, and a co-editor for a book titled Black and Buddhist, What Buddhists Can Teach Us About Race, Resilience, Transformation, and Freedom. So welcome all of you. For those those who are attending, I just want to say that I've asked the speakers to talk for about 5 minutes. and to talk about where they're located, insights about trauma and care from where they're situated, and I'm just delighted to be part of the conversation. So Danielle, do you want to start us off?
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. I'm so excited to sit on this panel with Dr. Rambo and some fine, distinguished persons. I feel like I should kiss your feet, so I'm kissing your feet virtually. So good to see all of you all here today. I am a CPE supervisor for Advocate Healthcare located in Illinois. I'm recently retired from pastoring. I no longer pastor Lincoln Memorial UCC Church, but I'm excited for the work of CPE during this time. A particular interest of mine that we may spend some time talking about today is the ways in which trauma impacts African American persons in the healthcare world, as well as persons in community of African descent who have to struggle and wrestle with police brutality. We are currently living in two pandemics, I like to say, not just the pandemic of COVID-19 virus, but the pandemic of police brutality. And so when we talk about trauma, I'm interested in and passionate about what are strategies and interventions that we can offer to African American persons in particular, who now must wrestle with healthcare disparities in light of COVID-19, as well as physical violence as a result of police brutality. And so I believe one method for how we can demonstrate care is first and foremost, think about, take serious, and begin to talk about the ways in which new studies by the American Psychological Association are now saying that there is such dynamic as racial trauma that is experienced by African American persons as a result of police brutality and also disparities in healthcare oppression. Psychologist by the name of Monica T. Williams has been doing some awesome research around this key term called racial trauma. And so first and foremost, it's so important for us to become self-aware of the link between daily microaggressions grounded in racism, as well as what we would like to call national attention or spotlight issues of police brutality and violence, and the ways in which these particular dynamics now impact the mental health of African American persons in particular. And so I suggest number two, that we also think about what are opportunities for mental health counseling for persons in light of COVID-19 and police brutality. How can we begin to suggest resources catered particularly to caring for persons who are struggling with racial trauma, and how can we begin to see, as Monica Williams suggests, racial trauma even causing PTSD, anxiety, and other types of depressions in persons of African descent. We must also, number three, and this is my final point in these moments, think about the impact of sociology, meaning lack of employment, poverty, underemployment, lack of healthcare insurance, lack of an inability to even see a doctor that exists in particular communities of color that are of low income. According to the Centers for Disease Control, when we think about COVID-19 in particular, we have to begin to look at the intersections of oppression. And that, why is it my African American grandmother on the south side of Chicago can unfortunately contract this virus and unfortunately die versus someone else from another culture or community who can contract this virus and survive and move on to live a healthy life? How do we begin to examine the role social oppression involved in longevity of survivors of COVID-19 versus others who unfortunately died. So I'm excited about this opportunity to speak with you along with other topics from our presenters today.
Thank you so much. Really honored to be here as well, and excited to learn from this group of people. So as Dr. Rambo, I realize I don't know how Dr. Rambo said. I currently work as a community organizer, and my work has really been around like bringing the tools around trauma, healing, and resilience from somatics, body work, chaplaincy, spiritual care, psychology to rabbis, educators, organizers, clergy in the kind of like everyday work when healing is part of what we're doing, and maybe like not the thing that people are coming to us for, but also like very much part of our charge and work. So we were asked to kind of reflect on like what are we seeing right now, and the first thing that came to mind to me is deep exhaustion paired with rage and anxiety and depression and frustration and deep grief and uncertainty, and coming from, as Danielle said, both the COVID crisis that we've been in and living in a white supremacist culture, a capitalism economic system that does not value life for humans or the planet. And I'm thinking really about this moment. One of the formative experiences of my life was my father was terminally ill for a number of years, and he actually outlived his prognosis by a few years. He was like, I lived past my use-by date, which was beautiful and wonderful. And also the extended period of living in uncertainty taught me a lot that unfortunately has been all too relevant now in this time of like not knowing what time period we're in or how long it will go on for or when it will shift. And that kind of uncertainty mixed with grief, I think, is both in the like individual experiences I'm having with people and also very much in the collective. The other thing that I want to name is that the Black-led uprisings summer, I think, show as well as anything could the ways in which trauma, healing, and resilience are not like separate, a binary where you're traumatized over here and you're resilient over here, but actually that in the midst of deep grief and loss and illness, there is incredible power and beauty and resistance coming from communities, especially Black and Brown communities, leading in this moment. So the other thing I wanted to offer, just thinking about kind of like, especially speaking to chaplains and spiritual caregivers about what we have to offer in this moment, is that a lot of offerings about trauma come from a medical model where when you think about physical wounding, there's like a hurt, you know, I break my arm, I get a cast and it heals. And that's like a kind of like linear journey, or also has a beginning and an end. It has a before and after. And we know that ongoing racism and systemic oppression and also homophobia and transphobia and anti-Semitism and ableism and like all of this violence that we're living in doesn't have like a clean beginning or end in people's lives. And part of like collective methods of care and wellness within these ongoing crises, I think needs to break with the kind of medical model of trauma having a beginning and end and a before and an after. And I think that spiritual care has a lot to offer different mindsets, like rather than the medical model mindset, that our religious, spiritual, and cultural stories have tools to kind of think about trauma, healing, and resilience in like less individual, more collective, and also just to break out of that before and after time, to kind of expand. So like for me as a Jew, the calendar that we're in, the Jewish calendar is both linear and cyclical, that we're both on a kind of historical journey of liberation and to Haolam Haba, or the world to come, and we're very much on that linear, or we like mark time in that way, but we're also very much on a cyclical season where, you know, like with holidays that of harvest and planting, and that just is like that's one example for me of how I can think about trauma and healing and what I can offer to people as a rabbi. And that's different from, I think, what the medical model offers, that teaches us about being in different times at once. And yeah, I'm excited to kind of hear what from people's spiritual and lineages, how people are making meaning and what tools people are offering that is creating thriving, creating kind of like power and sustainability and wellness in this season of so much struggle.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm very honored, privileged to be joining you this afternoon. My name is Mark Scott. I am not a chaplain. I'm not a clinician. I speak and work from the vantage point of a community member. I am a tent maker who every day must wear two hats. The hat on top toggles through each day. One hat is as the Boston Public Health Commission's Program Director for Trauma, Response, and Recovery Services. Someday, my title will change to Program Director for Trauma Recovery and Response Services. At the Boston Public Health Commission, I have the honor of working with the Neighborhood Trauma Team Network. Our vision of where we want to be, not where we're at, is that the team members of the network listen with open hearts to understand and mitigate the impact of trauma on residents from exposure to community violence. We would work meaningfully to collaborate with the community, respecting its knowledge, neighborhood, culture, and experience in our daily efforts to respond to community violence in a manner that promotes health. We work together, valuing the work of all team members and our partners in the larger system of prevention, response, and healing. We will come to understand that trauma is complex, historical, deeply rooted in the intersections of racism, power, control, privilege, and oppression. We would advocate together to amplify and maintain a lens of racial justice in the promotion of health equity. The network together forged that mission statement, and we continue to work to live into it. And the network understands that you get things done through collaboration. It is a partnership of 17 organizations working with a budget just increased by $1 million because Martin J. Walsh, Mayor of Boston, recognized that racism is a public health crisis. This recognition is due to a racialized pandemic, manifestations of white supremacy in the form of police brutality, and uprisings. Mayor Walsh is right. Racism is a public health crisis. But note, racism is more than a public health crisis, and violence is more than a public health crisis. Toward that point, I must wear another hat. As an elder in a tiny Pentecostal storefront church, the Azusa Christian Community, located in the Four Corners section of Dorchester. I live in the Codman Square section of Dorchester, but I stay right next door, but I try to stay in a Four Corners state of mind. Azusa is led by the Reverend Eugene F. Rivers III as pastor. Azusa appeared in 1983 in homage to the April 9, 1906 Holy Ghost Awakening at the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles under the leadership of Elder William J. Seymour. The community has since 1988, from its perch in Four Corners, Dorchester, done much to resist violence, advance understanding, and promote justice. Back to the Neighborhood Trauma Team Network. It includes 2 hospitals, 6 neighborhood trauma teams working in 6 neighborhoods disproportionately impacted by community violence. Each neighborhood trauma team is a community health center and a community-based organization. Community Health Center is working with the trauma clinician and the family advocate. The CBO is working with grassroots connections in the neighborhood. The health center and the community-based organization work together as a team. The network has a team of mobile clinicians and community responders answering a 24/7 free confidential support line and physically responding to incidents of community violence. And it has a survivor created and led organizations. We as a network respond to scenes of homicide with care and concern using psychological first aid as a tool of healing, connect with victims brought to the emergency department in the hospitals, most frequently Boston Medical Center and Brigham and Women's Hospital, but also Beth Israel, Children's Hospital, Kearney Hospital, and Mass General Hospital. In the tragedy of a homicide, the survivor-led organization, the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, will support the family in laying their loved one to rest with dignity and compassion. They're then available for a lifetime of building community and healing. The clinical teams at the health center work on short and long-term mental health services. The grassroots community-based organizations work on community outreach and engagement. Learn more about it at our website, neighborhoodhealing.com. If you're in Boston and exposed to trauma due to community violence, call the 24/7 free confidential support line at 617-431-0125. I find the work difficult. My wife has noted the strain, but I would not want to be anywhere else but here. I want to close by just sharing about 3 clergy members and 1 chaplain who are part of the network. First is Pastor Liz Walker. She introduced me to Professor Rambo's work, Spirit and Trauma, A Theology of Remaining. Pastor Walker and Colleen Sharker host Can We Talk in the basement of Roxbury Presbyterian Church. Can We Talk is a coming together of neighbors from across the Boston region to share their various traumas. It is a sacred place, and the church basement is a place of healing, the place I go for my own healing. Secondly is Tina Cherry, Chaplain Tina Cherry. She's the mother of Louis D. Brown, who was slain in 1993 at the age of 15 in our neighborhood. Out of that unspeakable place, she gave birth to the Peace Institute. The Peace Institute, through tremendous hard work and the principles of peace, unity, faith, hope, courage, justice, forgiveness, has restored many hundreds of families surviving in the aftermath of homicide. She has given birth to other survivor-created and led efforts that leverage power from pain. The Neighborhood Trauma Team Network would not exist without the leadership of Chaplain Cherry and the Peace Institute. 3, Pastor Victor Price. He pastors the Second Church in Dorchester, which is right around the corner from my home. He is one of those community responders that respond to a scene. He's a former clinician with Massachusetts Child Protection Agency. And finally, Pastor David Searles, who is the pastor of the Central Assembly of God Church in East Boston. He's a member of the East Boston Neighborhood Trauma Team. He's part of the organizing team for peace walks and peace talks to process and absorb trauma at the community level. He was called on a Sunday night in December 10th, 2017, by a family who was in church on Sunday morning, seeking to draw nearer to God, and whose son, Duncan Ketter, was murdered that night. He was called, he was at the scene, he helped organize the vigil in East Boston, he ministered the funeral, he supported members of the church impacted by loss, he attended the memorial in Kenya, as they were immigrant family from Kenya. He interacted with the justice system to this day, provided pastoral care, supported with food for the family for days between the incident and the funeral. And the support goes on. The case has not yet come to trial for the people who were arrested. But I just wanted to note on the importance of food in the aftermath of death. And I turn to James Baldwin, who wrote the following in Notes of a Native Son. He is writing about a family gathering on the news of the passing of his father. The man Baldwin, who had a complicated relationship with his father, comments, "Thou knowest this man's fall, but thou knowest not his wrestling." But Baldwin says, "In the house was suddenly full of relatives, friends, hysteria, and confusion. And I quickly left my mother, the children to the care of those impressive women who, in Negro communities at least, automatically appear at a time of bereavement, armed with lotions, proverbs, and patience, and an ability to cook." So I know some of the participants are waiting lunch, and we have conversation yet to have, so I will yield with that comment about food, and I will stop talking.
Thank you. Thank you. Good day, everyone. Trauma, I'm not an expert, but here's the truth of the matter. I've been traumatized. And there's nothing that I could have done to prevent that. And, I'm thinking about our conversation and other conversations I've had with other people. Being white will not protect you from trauma. Being a man will not protect you from trauma. Being a Christian will not protect you from trauma. All these privileged groups that we've come to understand as being privileged groups, being privileged will not protect you from trauma. And so I'm a productive person. I'm a person who doesn't prey on other people. I'm not a sociopath, but I have been traumatized. And I think it's important to say that because with pretty much every challenge that we have to being human comes also sometimes with stigma, right? So when people say, "I've been traumatized," other people may immediately go into denying the pain that the person is trying to express. So I thought about it, it's like, oh yeah, even trauma, the fact that we all may experience some level of trauma in our lives is still cause for stigmatization. So I went online and saw that Psychology Today did an article on trauma and stigmatization. And what they said is that these are some of the common myths of trauma. One, that it is the survivor's fault. Two, that the survivor asked for it. Three, that they deserved it. Four, that they are lying about their experience. Certainly it couldn't be that bad. That men cannot be survivors. And again, it couldn't have been that bad, right? Because see, what I see is that you're a functioning person. And so it couldn't be as bad as you think. So I want to share the two experiences that I had, not because I need to be taken care of, because I don't. And I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to trigger any traumas that any of you may have. But one of the traumas, the very first one I can remember, is when I was 8 years old, and I learned that my father, who was 35, died suddenly. Well, as an 8-year-old, no one told me about what it means to be alive, what it means to get ill, and what it means to die. So this fact of life was shocking to me. I saw my father one day who was going to golf, and the next time I saw him, he was in a coffin. And as a child, back when I was a child, adults didn't talk to you about the facts of life, right? So I had to make sense of that by myself. And the sense that I made of it was, life is short. You probably won't live past your 35th year. And you better live life to the fullest, which meant to me I didn't commit to anything. Lots of projects went undone. I was afraid that my mother was going to die and I was going to be an orphan, these sorts of things, right? So that's one trauma. Oh, and also, yeah, it just kind of, my father's death kind of just, how can I put it? Well, I guess I already explained it. It impacted the way, I couldn't go to a funeral after my father's wake. Just going to a funeral, I remember as an adult then going to a funeral of someone I didn't know and crying my eyes out. I cried louder than anybody in the room. And that told me, this is obviously not about this person who I don't know. This is about my father, this unresolved grief. Okay. Another time I was in college, so I was 20, I think I was 20, 19 or 20. Longer story short, I was accosted by someone who approached me from behind and took my neck like this. After that, I could not stand having people behind me, right? Now, I share those with you to say that trauma comes in different forms at different parts of our lives, sometimes unexpected, and we can live through it. But I think as caregivers, regardless of whether we are in hospital, hospice, prison, university, wherever we work, even as spiritual friends who don't consider ourselves to be spiritual caregivers, that there might be something in a person's life that has negatively impacted their ability to be free thinkers, free beers, doubt. We doubt ourselves. And it's important for us to think about these myths that I shared with you. And as spiritual caregivers, commit to not proliferating myths and also not blaming the people we care for and care about for the pain that they have experienced. Narrative counseling, narrative therapy can be helpful for people who have experienced trauma because it allows them to get it out, especially when they know other people might blame them for the pain that they've experienced. But when the trauma is severe, narrative, it's been said that narrative is not enough. It's not just enough to tell our story. That somatic experiences, somatic therapies, working with the energies in the body is very helpful for helping heal trauma. And then lastly, I'll close with this, because I think as spiritual caregivers in the political context we are in now, that we should consider being more public theology oriented and calling out the ways that politicians traumatize us. I think part of the reactions that we're seeing, the insurgents, is a reaction to being traumatized. And even people who would think that their pain might be embraced, like veterans, soldiers, when President Trump denied their pain, we need to call that out. And I think calling it out is also another way of destigmatizing trauma. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so mindful of the power of our own narratives. I always you're mentioning and how this work is really layered in terms of individual trauma, collective trauma, even in our caring for our communities, that we're also, we're not separate from the work. A lot of times it really connects with our own deep histories. I know that's true for many of the chaplains also on the call. So I want to thank you for what you've offered. It reminds me that I would like to have another Zoom session with just this group. But this is not my time. I really want to open it up and invite folks to have questions, to send in your questions to the chat as they come, and Michael will make sure they get to us. I guess I just want to offer something out there for response. And that's something that Jessica mentioned about the medical model. And I'm thinking about Danielle's comment about how important Williams is, trying to get the symptoms of racial trauma, the use of the medical model in order to get recognition. And yet the limits of the Western medical model to really name trauma fully. There's something, I think, there with how do you advocate, or how do you show up with spiritual resources when the field of trauma and resilience is so defined psychologically? I'm interested in hearing, because many folks are partnering across lines with social workers, mental health professionals. How do you show up in those conversations with a kind of spiritual sensibility or spiritual lens? What does that look like in the work that you do?
One of my frustrations, and I'll be quick about saying this in this way, one of my frustrations about the history of spiritual care as it relates to chaplaincy is, in my opinion, there's always been a disconnect between spirituality and faith and social and emotional. And so I'm suggesting that we begin to think about the ways in which these types of these types of professions must really come together in some sense. Also, I think that my sadness in the field of chaplaincy is that oftentimes we sort of believe, because our history teaches us this, that if I want to be a chaplain, then I can only engage in conversations around spirituality and faith. But I think the tide is turning in light of police brutality, in light of racial disparities as a result of COVID-19. And I am suggesting that we recreate or reinvent our understandings of spiritual care methodologies to include providing social services and include providing referrals for emotional and mental health support, in particular with African American communities. Let me say, there are certain cultures where parts of ourself are not fragmented. Parts of ourself are intertwined, if you will. And so persons of African descent cannot cut off or divide their spiritual side from their emotional side and from their physical side. We often talk about holistic care, but interestingly enough, I don't necessarily believe in our field of chaplaincy we've lived that out. We've sort of promoted just staying on the spiritual side. And so I am really pushing an acronym or phrase I created in light of our two pandemics, is ministering to the African American self, where the S stands for social needs, the E stands for emotional needs, the L stands for life meaning and purpose needs, and then the F stands for faith needs. How do we begin to minister to the social, emotional, life meaning and purpose or existential needs first before we start having conversations about the faith needs, and really begin to see holistic care as important, particularly, again, persons of color. I think that's so important, so that we don't begin to see this field as fragmented or distinct from another field.
Anyone else want to comment on that before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I would just say that what comes up for me, Danielle, as I was listening to you, is chaplains, spiritual caregivers need to claim our power. Typically in the clinical context, when we were working with
Yes.
other professionals, it's other professionals telling us what we're about and us wanting so much to be in that setting that we say, yes, we will stay in that box.
That's it.
But
That's
yeah.
it. You're right. You're right. You're right.
So we have a question coming in, or actually someone would just like to hear the panelists, your thoughts about the use of ritual for trauma healing. Anyone want to speak to that?
I'll just say briefly that I think ritual can help make meaning and bring a person back to what they value. I would not lead with ritual as the treatment for trauma.
Jessica, you look like you wanted to weigh in.
I did, but then you just said it so succinctly. That's, now you got everything you needed, and now I'll just kind of like sprinkle a lot more words around it. Yeah, I mean, I think of ritual as one of the oldest healing methods or practices that humans have, of marking the seasons, lighting candles, singing, chanting. Like those are all somatic and embodied practices from before our ancestors like had a distinction between like psychological and somatic or something. You know, our ancestors were marking time, the year and life cycle, birth, maturity, relationships, illness and loss and death. Like we have within our traditions practices for that. I do think, yeah, what Dave said about ritual, spiritual leaders kind of like understanding what our skill sets are and partnering with other care providers. I like to think that like almost any like piece of ritual can be trauma informed or trauma sensitive, that we are aware of people coming in, kind of like what experiences shape them and how ritual might bring up experiences of trauma and lived experiences, and that's like something to be aware of in any ritual work. I guess the other thing I would say is like to think about like what a tool was created for, and to think about like when you're deviating from that. So like, or when you're adding to that, or and kind of like what other expertise you might need to like use something that was created for one thing for another. So, you know, I have used, I'm trying to think of an example of like in trans community and with trans folks who I work with, I've like done pre-surgery rituals that's like use Jewish ritual tradition to help people prepare and then also heal from gender affirming surgeries. And what's important for me in preparing that is like, this is a tool, this, you know, if I'm using a tool that was used for to like mark Jewish time, like Shabbat and Havdalah, to mark, to like make, to do a trans affirming ritual, to know that like, okay, I'm bringing my expertise and then I'm going to learn a lot of, I don't, you know, like I'm going to learn from people who've had, from trans folks about their experiences, and kind of like intentionally blend what and like stay in my lane of what I have to bring. If I'm bringing a ritual tool towards healing, I'm going to like be intentional about weaving and kind of like, yeah, I guess stay in my lane is the succinct word for what I'm trying to describe. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question, maybe Mark, you can start out in response to this question. How do we build the capacity of collectives, spiritual communities, political movements, to care for each other with a trauma lens? How do we build the capacity of collectives to care for each other with a trauma lens?
Yeah, that's extremely needed. And even if you go back to the first two questions, they highlight some of that. So ritual can be very helpful in organizing one's a moment and one's thoughts and how one will go forward. And it's something that is needed that we don't have enough of in the area of dealing with community violence. So there's violence, there will be often a vigil at the site of the violence. And then there may be for years after that, memorials that are set up. And it's people's expression of a need to grieve collectively in this community. And what we would need is someone to stay in their lane, just to pick on Jessica's comment, right? So I will stay in my lane, but I need about 3 or 4 other lanes coming alongside me in order to create this path towards healing. And that's the collaborative. And it's deeply needed. It goes to Danielle's point. We will provide the spiritual care, but you cannot separate it from the self. So you have to deal with the mental health. The narrative therapy will help, but I may need to pull on somebody else who can do somatic therapy. Ayo's point. And I was struck by the use of the words around self, and even that is circular, right? While the word goes in a linear direction, those things, my faith may come in before the social and then come back in around the emotional. And so the collaborative is the big challenge. And I can say in the work that we've done, one of the things I've experienced is that when you first put the people in the room that you want to collaborate, there's a lot of, I don't want to be here. I'm not sure about you people, right? Now we're a little too different. I'm not co-signing this, right? I value my reputation, and I don't know if I want to be associated with you all. And getting a good consultant, maybe you need 2 at the same time, paying them some money to help you forge that collaborate, and then keep them around to sustain it, is maybe a practical suggestion for how that statement I made at the beginning. You get things done through networks, right? I'm borrowing it from the Interreligious Institute for Social Change, and that dynamic interplay of different people, and the network itself will suffer trauma, right? I think of our network, we've lost people to COVID. We've had people who've lost family members to homicide. One observation someone made of trauma is that it is actually, in spite of all the stigma that Ayo rightly pointed out, it's actually a near ubiquitous human experience, right? It's something we share as humans, and yet maybe because it's a medicalized model, you go to somebody and say, this terrible thing just happened to you, this terrible thing just happened in your neighborhood. Is there a way we can talk? I'm good. Especially men. I mean, I can speak for men. I'm good. I got this. Don't worry about it. Right. So just the statement, it was powerful. I've experienced trauma. And there was nothing I could have done to prevent it, and it was not my fault. Right. I'm often hopeful that becomes an opening for what's the path forward, circular as it may be, right? Cyclical as it may be, to pick up on Rabbi Jessica's, right? So yes to collaboratives.
Yeah.
They're hard.
So Mark, you're reminding me of, I guess it's just a comment, when you just kind of mentioned losing your own, one of your own staff. And I'm just really mindful of many of us accounting for our own losses, right? The losses of family members, the losses, or even anticipated losses, right, along the way. I received a message ahead of this webinar from someone who really wanted to lift up, I was very grateful to lift up the rising suicide rates at this time, and the anticipation of losses due to folks taking their own lives, and not some traumas come to public attention right now and others don't, right? And so I'm mindful also of the various ways that we can lose folks to various forms of death and loss. So this question I think goes to Io. I think is in response to some of the to your comments that you made about public theology, and somebody was just commenting that many chaplains work for are employees of institutions, which may limit the ability to speak prophetically or as public theologians. Or they do so at the risk of their job security. So any comments on how to handle that, to speak prophetically may involve a level of risk.
It always does, doesn't it? It wouldn't be called prophetic if it wasn't risky. And not just risky, sometimes dangerous. So, and if you're the only one, right, it's easy to just get rid of you. But if through your relationships, you can begin to shift the culture towards the transformation of those who make decisions, that might be the route to take and also keep your job. But I would also say that in order to, and maybe this is a trauma that can be avoided to some degree, moral injury. Think about how deeply held your beliefs are around this particular issue, and how long you can live in opposition to those deeply held values and beliefs, and whether you need to sacrifice yourself, a part of your well-being, in order to stay in that system, to advocate, not wish for change, but actually advocate for it. Like trauma, being public theologians in places that are risky for prophetic voices to be heard is complicated, and there's no one answer to what is the thing to do. But I would just suggest try not to do it by yourself, because it's so easy to dismiss one person.
Thank you, Io. I'm reminded that I was talking to a group of CPE residents, and they really convinced me that I can't write about trauma without the companion moral injury, right? So when I just finished co-authoring an ebook for the Chaplaincy Lab, and I said, well, we can't just do something about trauma without dealing with the impact of moral injury and how those two are so coupled, especially in this moment, right? In which many of us are doing our work under conditions that would be considered morally compromised, right? From moral dilemmas to moral, not necessarily even moral injury, but the moral strain and stress of many of us living within institutions. So thanks for lifting that up as well. Mark, quick word, and then Michael's giving me the cutoff. Do you want to close us out?
I just heard you mention about suicide, right, and other forms of loss. And, we have in the city of Boston about as many suicides as we do homicides. And you will frequently hear about the homicide because it's loud, it's public, it's political, and the violence is political. But healing is quiet and private. You never hear about that. And suicide is very quiet. You rarely hear about the suicides. The only thing I wanted to lift up are those members of the community who, out of that law, those kind of, nor do you hear about a miscarriage, the loss of a child in the process of giving birth. So or before the birth ever happens. But I can think of at least 2 people in the community who out of each of those kinds of loss have been able to, over time, not in a linear way, been able to create places of healing for other people who've experienced similar traumas. And so in the work that we do around community violence, it's very important to build that collaborative between we're staying in our lane, they're in their lane, but we're collaborating.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mark and Danielle and Io and Jessica, for the gift of your time and your wisdom. Thank you very much. Michael?
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Shelly, for moderating, facilitating, hosting today. What you might not see on the audience side of the thing is that being on a webinar takes a lot of energy. I know it looks like we're all just sitting here talking to each other, and to an extent that's true, but to be sort of on for an hour can be difficult. So thank you to all 5 of you for joining us. I do want to announce that we just published Shelly's ebook, co-authored with Joe, whose name has escaped me at the moment, but also Jasmine Okafor from ACPE. I'm putting a link to it in the chat right now, and so you can find that at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab website. It's free, it's wonderful. I think it's probably the most comprehensive ebook that we have published to date, and so I encourage you very strongly to go.
Way saying it's very long.
It is very comprehensive, and I mean that in a good way. It's an ebook, so you can find what you're looking for very quickly. So go check that out. I'll remind everyone this has been recorded, so don't worry if you missed a point or something. You'll get a recording here in the next couple of days. So one more time, thank you all for joining us. Thank the audience for being with us. Thank the panelists. It's been wonderful. And until we are together again, have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.